Hi, everyone. I'm Ken W, and I'm here today to talk about my new book with LSU Press, Abraham Lincoln and the Heroic Legend, Reconsidering Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. I'm actually speaking to you from the land of Lincoln, Champaign, Illinois, having relocated here after teaching for many years in the SEC at Auburn University. What are the origins of this book? What's my argument? What's it about? Let me try to give you a brief sense of what I do with this book. It's been about 5.5 years ago since I was last here to discuss my most recent book that I did with LSU Press, and that was this book. You may remember it, The Howling Storm, Weather, Climate, and the American Civil War. I did quite a few book talks in the year or two after that book came out, most of them online, not all. And I started to notice a really curious phenomenon. As you might expect with a book about weather, most people had questions during the Q&A about, well, weather and climate. How many tornadoes were there during the war? What was the coldest day of the war? That sort of thing. But I was really surprised at first to discover that there were so many questions about Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's a pretty major character in the Howling Storm. And one of my arguments in that book was that Lincoln did not always understand the reality of logistics in the Civil War when it came to weather, how difficult it was to move troops through rain or snow or heat and dust. It seems so easy sometimes, I think, from the White House to imagine that, say, George McClellan could move up the peninsula 20 miles a day, when in fact it was darn impossible given the weather of that spring. And as the questions started to come in, I was struck by a couple of things, how vehemently, passionately, people wanted to defend Lincoln as flawless, a military genius, obviously so much smarter than his generals, the most modern commander-in-chief, the first commander-in-chief, certainly better than someone like George B. McClellan, or say George Meade at the Potomac after Gettysburg. This happens so frequently, almost in every talk I gave, that I started to wonder why. Why do we think that Lincoln was a military genius? In terms of strategy, operations, tactics, why do we think of him as the first modern general in the White House, if you will? Where did this idea come from? Was it true? And finally, one night, sitting at this very computer in this very room, talking to my good friend, the late Pete Carmichael, I decided to write a book about this topic, this notion of Lincoln as this brilliant military thinker and commander-in-chief. I wish Pete was around to see the book completed. Unfortunately, he is not. I needed a sort of shorthand term for this idea of Lincoln's military genius. And so after a few months, deep in folklore studies, among other things, I came up with the phrase I wanted to use. This idea of Lincoln's military brilliance, I call the heroic legend. Legend because it's a story about real people in a not too distant past. Historians like me love to use the word myth. Think about it. You've heard of the myth of the lost cause. There are all sorts of myths about the war, Gettysburg myths. I myself, many years ago as a young scholar, created a phrase that is still used in Appalachian studies, I believe, the myth of Unionist Appalachia. So we're always talking about myths. But from reading folklore, I discovered that myths are really about religion. They're really about the gods, Zeus, Athena, Apollo. They're stories that people thought to be true. but they're also stories that took place in a far, far distant past. Abraham Lincoln lived relatively recently as compared to the ancient Greeks. The Civil War was real. Stories about him are properly called legends and not myths. Heroic legend, in this case, because I started out, I think like most Americans, thinking about folklore, reading Joseph Campbell. Now, I discovered pretty quickly as I got into folklore studies that most experts in that field aren't too impressed with Joseph Campbell. And they find all sorts of problems with his methodology, his conclusions. But nonetheless, Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey permeates American society in surprising ways, more than I think I ever realized. Not only the subject of one of the most watched documentaries in the history of PBS, but you may know Joseph Campbell's hero's journey best if you've ever seen the Star Wars movies. George Lucas actually rewrote the original script to the first Star Wars movie after reading Joseph Campbell and later helped produce the documentary about him. If you want to understand what the hero's journey is, really all you have to do is watch the first Star Wars movie. Young man, middle of nowhere, gets a call to adventure, leaves home, goes on a series of adventures, meets friends, discovers enemies. There's a climactic battle of some sort, and the hero, in some way, saves the world. That's a pretty boiled down idea of the heroic journey. And that's sort of, I think, what we've done with Lincoln. We can talk more about that if you want. So we have this story, this legend of Lincoln as a military commander, if you will, commander in chief, more brilliant than certainly anybody who was working for him until U.S. Grant and William comes to Sherman eventually. How did this start? What were the origins of this legend? I discovered that it's a lot more complicated than I expected. And I think the idea of the heroic legend began with Abraham Lincoln himself. The first half of my book is about Lincoln in the White House. And what we see is a really interesting story. Abraham Lincoln came to Washington early in 1861 with next to no military experience. He had served a few weeks in the frontier militia in Illinois 30 years earlier. He had never been particularly interested in military affairs. And here he is, a new president with states seceding. And during the Fort Sumter crisis, as his government tried to decide what to do about Fort Sumter, he took the reins of power. In doing so, he rejected the man who was considered to be the most brilliant military mind in the United States and among supposedly the leading generals in the world, and that was Winfield Scott, who had been an American hero since the War of 1812. Within days of being confronted by the Fort Sumter crisis, Lincoln rejected Scott's advice. At this stage, he was very self-confident. He understood the politics of the moment, perhaps more than the military necessities of the moment. And so he made the decision to send a relief force to Fort Sumter, which of course began the war. In the first part of 1861, Lincoln's military ideas were still pretty undeveloped, but then that was probably true of everyone else. He initially believed that the war could be won with a naval blockade on the Confederacy and an attack on Charleston, South Carolina. When the Upper South states seceded, notably including Virginia, that seemed to be out the window. And he gravitated toward a plan that had been proposed by young General Irvin McDowell to launch a quick strike into Virginia, defeat the Confederates, and somehow end the war. That battle resulted in defeat. Lincoln continued to develop and refine and broaden his military horizon. well into 1861, began to develop strategic ideas, uh, operational ideas, how to make that strategy work, and even was thinking about tactics, what troops should do in the face of the enemy. Increasingly, he developed those ideas in concert and then in opposition to the general who replaced Winfield Scott as commanding general of the United States Army, and that was George B. McClellan, who came to Virginia after a successful campaign in what is now modern West Virginia. He commanded the Army of the Potomac from July 1861 until November 1862. He was general-in-chief, replacing Scott from May 1861 until March of 1862. I like to think of McClellan as sort of the whetstone on which Lincoln sharpened and developed his ideas of how to win the war militarily. We have a tendency in the Civil War field just to denigrate George B. McClellan immediately. Trust me, if I want a quick joke, a quick laugh at a Civil War roundtable, for example, all I have to do is mention Braxton Bragg or George B. McClellan, and people will laugh. He's thought to be this terrible, terrible general, pompous, anxious, disrespectful, and not very good at his craft. What was really happening in 1861 is this. McClellan represented what was current modern military thinking in the United States Army, thinking that had developed in the war with Mexico, where he had been, and had later been refined by various warring powers in the Crimean War in the mid-1850s. And McClellan had been there too, as an observer. McClellan believed in mass armies, well-trained professional armies, or as close to professionalism as you could get. And he did not believe in frontal assaults. The idea was to minimize casualties using maneuver, movement, by moving one's army into the flank or the rear of an opposing force. See my hand moving around here. That's called a turning movement. Abraham Lincoln called this strategy. McClellan represents conventional thinking. Lincoln thinks that sort of war is going to take too long and perhaps eventually cost too many casualties in the long run. He wants something very different. McClellan's great turning movement was the Peninsula Campaign, and it failed. The war went on. After the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln replaced McClellan. But by then, he had also developed, I think, his firm ideas about what his generals should be doing. A journalist and relief worker named Mary Livermore came to the White House about this time, end of October, early November 1862, and met with Lincoln and remembered what he said to her. Talking about the war, the military situation is far from bright. The country knows it as well as I do. The fact is the people haven't yet made up their minds that we are at war with the South. They haven't buckled down to the determination to fight this war through. For they've got the idea into their heads that we're going to get out of this fix somehow by strategy. That's the word, strategy. General McClellan thinks he is going to whip the rebels by strategy. And the Army's got the same notion. They have no idea that the war is to be carried on and put through by hard, tough fighting that will hurt somebody. And no headway is going to be made while this delusion lasts. What Lincoln wanted by the late fall of 1862 was hard, tough fighting that would hurt somebody. Put a federal army between Washington and Richmond, draw that Confederate army out into the open, and destroy it, while always protecting Washington. Because as a politician, Lincoln knew he couldn't afford to lose his capital, even for a few days. He also believed across the rest of the front, all the way out to Texas, in coordinated attacks that would make use of superior Northern manpower. An idea, by the way, that he seems to have taken from McClellan and Winfield Scott. He didn't really create it, as we often hear. Lincoln spent the next months trying to find a general who would implement his vision of how to fight and win the war. And that meant East, and to an extent in the West, going through one general after another. Burnside, Hooker, George Meade, who always remains in control of the Army of the Potomac after Gettysburg, but eventually bringing U.S. Grant in as the new general-in-chief of the Army. And Grant eventually implements what Lincoln had wanted. I think it's really interesting to note that even Grant, right before he becomes general-in-chief, this is at the beginning of 1864, is still thinking about what Lincoln might have denigrated as strategy. What he envisions in Virginia is a massive turning movement that would land the army in Suffolk, Virginia, and take it all the way down into North Carolina to cut off Lee from his resources. That's essentially what Grant had done in Mississippi leading up to the siege of Vicksburg. But Grant soon found out that's not what the president wanted. And hence the Overland campaign, those massive armies pushing down from Washington with coordination from the Shenandoah Valley, fighting day after day after day after day. And Sherman in Georgia, the Atlanta campaign, the same thing, fighting day after day after day. It worked. It eventually worked. Lee surrendered. And then on Good Friday, 1865, Lincoln suddenly assassinated at Ford's Theater. The war soon came to an end. But the discussion about Lincoln's role in winning that war on the battlefield had really only begun. Second half of the book deals with the development of the idea that Lincoln himself was the major military player in the war. Right after his death, there were some early biographers who suggested that Lincoln had been something of a far-seeing military seer, but they were soon forgotten. A great argument among Lincoln historians began over, do we talk about Lincoln the president or Lincoln back on the prairie? Eventually, his wartime secretaries, especially John Hay and John Nicolay, to an extent William O. Stoddard and the journalist Noah Brooks, who would have been a secretary had Lincoln lived, began to deal with this issue. And it's Hay and Nicolay, in their massive 10-volume biography of Lincoln, who firmly make the argument that Abraham Lincoln was a flawless military genius, self-taught, although he intuitively already had everything it took to be a military thinker, and that it was he, not Grant, not the others, it was he who really saw the way to win the war on the battlefield. Now, what's interesting here is that their biography, in so many ways, shaped Lincoln historiography forever. They had access to papers owned by Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, that no one else was even allowed to see until after World War II. So many of the stories that we learned and our ancestors learned about Lincoln came through Hay and Nicolay. But the fact is, most of their contemporaries didn't believe it, at least not this part of it. They did not automatically agree that Lincoln was this brilliant military thinker. Usually when they talked about Lincoln as commander-in-chief, they talked about two things: his ongoing arguments with George B. McClellan, and something that was called the gentle legend, which was about Lincoln's kindness toward prisoners, and especially toward condemned soldiers, how Lincoln loved to find ways to pardon soldiers who were about to die for crimes like desertion or cowardice in the field. That's what Hay and Nicolay's contemporaries wrote about when they wrote about Lincoln as commander-in-chief. And that's what the next generations tended to write about as well. By the 1930s, Lincoln's reputation as a military thinker was actually at its low point. Carl Sandburg, who wrote probably the dominant Lincoln biography of the 20th century, um, seemed to believe every Lincoln story he ever heard, and yet did not argue that Lincoln was a particular genius in terms of making. That's just not there. You can find glimpses of it, but the full argument is not there. About 5 miles from where I'm sitting right now in Urbana, Illinois, James G. Randall, University of Illinois, the first academic to ever specialize in Abraham Lincoln, had even less respect for Lincoln as a military thinker. Randall tended to defend McClellan, thought that Lincoln got in the way, he mucked up things, really didn't know what he was doing. So how on earth do we get from that to people in Q&A sessions giving me a hard time for saying that Lincoln was perhaps less than perfect? When change came, it did not come in the United States initially. It came in Great Britain. The British Army, despite a reputation for being, the famous phrase, lions led by donkeys, the British Army had a tradition of intellectually training its rising officers in military history. The problem was, until World War I, the British Army was dominated by people who glorified the Confederacy. So if you went to the academy at Sandhurst, or if you later went to the British Staff College, what you were learning was all about Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and movement and deception and things that worked pretty well when you were fighting colonial wars around the world, but didn't work so well on the Western Front starting in 1914, a war that developed very quickly into a war of trenches and wire and very little movement. During the war, and especially after war, there were British officers who thought that they had been sold a bill of goods. They had been taught the wrong lessons. They had missed the modernity of the second half of the American Civil War. What they should have been learning about, they thought, was Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant and the trenches of Petersburg. 3 British soldiers, J.F.C. Fuller, who you may have heard of, Colin Ballard and Frederick Morris, who I'm guessing you haven't heard of, wrote very influential books in the 1930s, late 20s and early 30s, in which they argued for a complete reevaluation of Lincoln as a military thinker. Morris saw a Lincoln who grew as a military thinker in connection with Grant. Ballard entitled his book, Abraham Lincoln is Military Genius. And essentially he was born that way. These are also men who saw a war coming in the 1930s. They assumed it would be with the Soviet Union. They wanted to prepare their nation, Great Britain, for that war. And so they wanted to teach other lessons that they thought they had learned from Lincoln about centralizing government, centralizing the war effort. One political leader working through one powerful military leader to win the war. When the war came, World War II, it seemed to prove their ideas correct. At least that was the thought at the time. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill had somehow followed the Lincoln model by centralizing power, developing strategy, and seeing it through. After the war, 2 American authors brought those British arguments into the American mainstream. Kenneth Williams, who was actually a math professor at Indiana, was also a veteran of the Western Front, wrote a multi-volume work called Lincoln Finds a General. It's very much in the Colin Ballard tradition of Lincoln's near perfection. And roughly about the same time, in Baton Rouge at LSU, T. Harry Williams wrote a book called Lincoln and His Generals, very much in the Morris and Fuller tradition of Lincoln growing into the job, but becoming at the end a masterful military leader. And it's hard to remember today how influential T. Harry Williams was, and still is, shaping views of Lincoln and McClellan and Meade into the Civil War centennial. You can find those views, say, in Ken Burns' Civil War series. To this day, the United States Army recommends that young officers read T. Harry Williams, Lincoln and His Generals. Those ideas, originally thought up by people like Hay and Nicolay, revived by the British soldier historians, and then brought into the American mainstream by Williams and Williams, became canon. So that while, as historians, we argue about nearly every other aspect of Abraham Lincoln's life, from his racial views to his sexuality to you name it, we all still pretty much accept the idea that as commander-in-chief, Lincoln was either perfect or near. And what I hope this book does is open a discussion, a reevaluation of exactly those ideas. Why aren't we asking ourselves, was Lincoln really this marvelous, greatest commander-in-chief we've ever had? At a time in American history when a lot of us are discussing the powers of commanders-in-chief, the powers of commanders-in-chief to make war, sometimes without Congress, sometimes without even national support. Maybe it's worthwhile going back to the foundation, because every American president since Harry Truman who has expanded the powers of the commander-in-chief has cited Lincoln for president. That, in a nutshell, is Abraham Lincoln and the heroic legend. If you have questions, I hope you do. I would love to try to take several of them in the next few minutes and answer as many as I can. Thanks for listening to me.
And thank you so much for that just really wonderful presentation. I learned so much, much more than I thought I was going to. And yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, also for tuning in. I want to say a special thank you to David for tuning in from Chicago. And like Ken mentioned, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will be asking Ken live over the next 10 to 15 minutes. So don't be shy. No question is a bad question, and we'd love to hear from you. I want to start, Ken. There's this one thing that you said earlier on. You compared the story of Lincoln to the hero's journey, popular in some of our favorite movies. You mentioned Star Wars, and this really kind of blew my mind. And I'm thinking of other kind of big early American stories, in particular like Huck Finn, which came out about 20 years after that Lincoln's assassination. But it's such an archetypal American story. I guess I'm wondering if you could help me understand Lincoln's story in the context of like this kind of burgeoning post-Civil War kind of American identity.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things about that. First of all, there are a couple of very good authors out there named Shelton and Lawrence, and I cite a couple of their books, who argue against Americans paying too much attention to Campbell's hero's journey, because they say we have our own version of that. We have an American monolith, as they call it, which goes back in some ways to the Pilgrims, maybe just back to the Cowboys, certainly back to Lincoln. He fits into that. But beyond that, Lincoln historians, I think for generations, have understood this legendary quality of Lincoln's life. And you mentioned Huck Finn. We think about Horatio Alger, those stories of poor young boys working their way up. Well, I mean, the first stories that look like that, many of them were about Abraham Lincoln. Many of Lincoln's biographers have always made those comparisons to, Huck Finn, Daniel Boone, people were coming up from the frontier. So it's a very American sort of story. What strikes me is how the notion of the hero's journey, as it has become embedded, especially in American history since World War II, has become more and more important than ever. I think not only to the Lincoln story, but to our stories in general. A place I really like is the Abraham Lincoln Museum in Springfield, Illinois. But if you go there, There are sort of two, they call them journeys. There are two tours that you can take through the museum of Lincoln's life, which include the sort of displays that you might see at Disney World because they were developed by people who used to work at Disney. And Disney, more than any other studio, embraced this idea of hero's journey after Star Wars. You can name all sorts of Disney movies, live action, animation that follow that basic storyline. It's how we tell the story now, I think, more than ever. Um, so it's complicated, but I think it's real.
Is there something for Lincoln scholars in general, and I know your book is maybe in some ways a departure from other Lincoln scholars, but I'm wondering, would you say the origin of Lincoln's legend is kind of inextricably tied to his being assassinated?
Well, I think the assassination has a lot to do with how would we have viewed Lincoln if he had lived until the end of his second term? Had he been the person in charge of Reconstruction? We don't really know what he would have done or what the reaction would have been, or really anything beyond what happened at Ford's Theater. I think that certainly adds to the legendary element because so often in these stories, Joseph Campbell wrote about this, but a lot of other people in folklore studies write about this. That's what happens to the hero at the end of the hero's journey. He either, gets an award from Princess Leia or dies. It's kind of a classic end to those stories, uh, especially if you want to take them back into antiquity. It has a lot to do with it because we see him at his height. And I will say, too, some of the earliest biographers of Lincoln were very deeply pious men, very Christian men, and they could not help but notice that Lincoln was shot on Good Friday and that his funeral
Right.
sermons were preached on Easter. So they made that connection as well very quickly. And it added to that aura that grew up around Lincoln uh, really almost from the moment he died.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about maybe some more on the ground things. In particular, I guess I want to start um, with asking you if you could tell us a little bit about what it was like being a commander in chief in this era, in the American Civil War era in general.
Well, I think that's really fascinating. That's part of the story. Abraham Lincoln was the first modern commander in chief in the sense of being a commander in chief that we would recognize. Before Lincoln, presidents had deferred quite often to Congress. They had done things like appoint generals, but they certainly weren't stretching the bounds of the Constitution, as Lincoln admitted he did himself. It's interesting that during the war with Mexico, when James K. Polk was president, Polk came closest to that in terms of making war from the White House. And among his most vehement critics was Abraham Lincoln, who thought that making war was Congress's job. The president can make a case, but it's up to Congress to decide if the country goes to war. When Lincoln became president, at this moment of crisis, I think we have to remember that this was a supremely dangerous moment in the history of our country, and Congress was not in session. Lincoln did things that presidents had not done before. He called out troops. He raised money without congressional approval. He instituted the naval blockade um, essentially on his own. He did things that no commander in chief had done before. And when Congress came back in July, he essentially said, I'm sorry, I know I've met the Constitution. Please give me approval. And they did. He expanded what a commander in chief could do. Now, I'll add this. Try not to be too presentist, but I will add this. Lincoln always said that what he was doing was in an emergency, it was extraordinary, and he did not want to set precedent for future presidents. And after the war, after his death, the Republicans basically brought the military down almost to pre-war levels. Um, they agreed that was just a strange moment in American history, but we're not going to keep doing that. It's Harry Truman, really during the uptick to the Korean conflict, who begins to argue that he can do the things Lincoln did because he has inherent powers to do them, not extraordinary powers, but inherent routine powers to make war without a declaration. And then there are presidents who follow along up to today who continue to do that. And we've come to accept the notion that a president can, bomb a certain nation or two without the approval of Congress or approval of the American public. Lincoln would say that's a distortion of what he did.
This is
But
fascinating.
nonetheless,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, but it grows out of what Lincoln did. I think that's the foundation. If you want to go back a few years to when George W. Bush was fighting the war in Iraq, there was controversy over things like imprisoning people at Guantanamo Bay and elsewhere around the world. And Bush administration officials went to Congress and said, and I'm quoting them almost exactly, we can do this because Abraham Lincoln did it. We have precedent.
What I was going to say is it's what's really fascinating about that is it's a different branch, but it reminds me of the judicial branch, which is sort of based on precedent. So that's interesting to see how that's working in a different way in a different branch.
Yeah, Lincoln, let's not forget, tended to ignore the Supreme Court during his presidency too.
I want to talk a little bit actually about this Reddit AMA you did. For those who
Yes.
don't know, it's called an Ask Me Anything. And it was for a very popular online community called our Ask Historians, a couple million members. Can you describe what an AMA is for those who don't know and a little bit about what your experience was like?
Well, it was a lot of fun, actually. An AMA, I mean, literally, I went online. I said, hi, I'm Ken Now. I wrote this book. Here's the basic idea of my book. And per instructions, I waited around for an hour and started responding to questions that came rolling in. Golly, I think over 100 questions. A couple of them were silly and fun. Some of them were very seriously intended. Most of them were, in fact. And we talked a lot online for about 2.5 hours about Lincoln as commander in chief. There were some people who had never picked up on this notion of Lincoln as a military genius in the first place, which I thought was interesting since it had been so in my face when Howling Storm came out. But it was a really fun experience and a great way to meet with, I think, the public. Um, I retired back in 2021. I don't teach anymore. I miss students. I miss talking to people about this sort of thing. And I've discovered really since COVID that dealing with history online is a great way to meet a lot more people than I used to in the past. The AAMA was very fun. I've recommended it to other authors already.
Yeah, there's actually one question that one of the sillier ones I remember was asking if Lincoln invented the pile driver. Is that right?
Yeah, that was the one that kind of threw me. And not to my knowledge, I'm guessing there were pile drivers before Abraham Lincoln. And there's always a question about Lincoln hunting vampires, which I've just come to accept.
There actually was one question that you were asked that I want to ask you now. I want to repeat it because I'm interested in it. And that was kind of related to what we were talking about earlier. What was Lincoln's best military move?
His best military move. Uh, I think recognizing eventually, it didn't happen all at once. I think recognizing that Ulysses S. Grant was the guy who was going to win the war for him. He went through generals. It took a while for him. He was on a learning curve. But I think bringing Grant to Washington is the moment, probably more than any other moment in the war, that was a real turning point. You can argue militarily that Antietam was a turning point. People argue about Gettysburg. I'm not convinced of that. The war dragged on for months after Gettysburg, but I think the appointment of Grant was a key moment. Maybe I've been too influenced by all those guys who were writing back in the 1920s and 1930s who emphasized Grant, but I think that's the moment.
As a Lincoln scholar, what books would you like to see written about Abraham Lincoln?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm not sure I'm a Lincoln scholar. I'm waiting to see what the community of actual Lincoln scholars think about me in this book. I've always been a traditional Civil War scholar, and those are actually a couple of different fields. What I would like to see is a reevaluation of Lincoln as commander in chief. And I think there are a couple of ways to do that. The first is that there's a lot of material that has not been mined, believe it or not. There's a massive series called the Official Records, which all of us use. I think there's a common belief in the Civil War community that everything's in the official records. That is absolutely not the truth. Yale Sternhurl wrote a wonderful book recently about, among other things, the flaws with the official records. There's a lot of material in Washington and other archives that no one's ever used to understand the day-to-day operations of the Army during that war and what role the White House played. So there's material there that one could use to get a broader sense of how the war effort was going. Another thing I talk about in the book, we have seen in the last few years a really interesting debate in the Civil War field about what do we do with the West, the so-called Indian Wars of 1861 to 65. Are those part of the Civil War, or are they something different? And I have friends on both sides, so I hesitate to take a firm side one way or the other, although I've been increasingly convinced that we should think of them as part of a broader moment that includes the Civil War. But whether or not you believe that the Sand Creek Massacre should be considered Civil War history, the fact remains Abraham Lincoln was the commander in chief everywhere in the United States. If he was the commander in chief to Grant, Sherman, McClellan, he was also the commander in chief of James Carleton when he conducted the ethnic cleansing of the Navajo. He was the commander in chief of John Chivington at the Sand Creek Massacre. I think one thing I would dearly love to see in his evaluation of Lincoln as commander in chief that encompasses everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific and beyond out into the seas where the United States Navy was involved in trying to crush the Confederate Navy. I think bringing Western history into the Civil War for this particular question, how do we evaluate Lincoln as a military commander in chief? Well, as commander in chief, I would love to see someone.
I think that's fascinating. So I'm really happy I asked actually. And I'm half apologizing for misspeaking earlier, with the caveat that I do want to say your last book, The Howling Storm, for those who don't know, was a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, and also won another prize that was the Colonel Richard Ulbrich Memorial Book Award.
Yeah.
So if those of you who don't know that, now you know. I have a couple more questions for you here, kind of compiled. Um, I just want to let everyone in the chat know that if you have a question for Ken, this is your last opportunity. I'd like to talk to you, Ken, a little bit about the future. And I want to know if you see yourself writing about Lincoln again.
Well, I am writing about Lincoln again, which is interesting, I think. My current big project is a book with LSU, a book of essays on the Army of the Potomac, which I am co-editing with Jennifer Murray, who used to be, well, I guess still is my doctoral student, but has gone on to be a very fine Civil War historian in her own right. And this book was actually Jen's idea. She's the lead editor. She brought me in to help with the project. But we put together a wonderful list of contributors. We're going to write about various aspects of the Army of the Potomac, which I think kind of still gets short shrift in comparison to Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And the chapter that I'm writing for that book involves something that I did not deal with a lot in the book we're talking about today. And that's actually going back and taking a look at the gentle legend. I'm trying to get a sense of who was Lincoln pardoning, how many cases was Lincoln involving himself in, not just death penalty cases, but all sorts of other cases. When was it happening? Why was it happening? Who was pressing him to rescue this soldier or that soldier? So I've been working my way through the Lincoln papers, and I have this massive, ugly spreadsheet I've made And it's really been fascinating to me to get a sense of what was really happening as opposed to this legend of the kind-hearted, gentle Lincoln that was not only propagated for generations after the war, but that we still run into today. So that's what I'm working on. I'm not done with him yet, or he's not done with me yet.
I appreciate you telling us about that project, and we're all excited to read it. I want to know, for those who want to know and want to see you again, can you tell us a little bit about some appearances you have coming up, book talks, podcasts, etc.?
Well, yeah, I'm doing a talk for Kevin Levin on Friday. Many of your viewers will probably know Kevin through his Substack, Civil War Memory. So I'll be on again on Friday. I'm doing a talk in a couple of months, again online, for the Louisiana Museum in New Orleans. And in June, I'll be in Louisville, Kentucky at the Filson Club for a day-long symposium, which I think is really fascinating, called The Future of Lincoln. And I'll be part of a panel discussing Lincoln on that date. Um, so I'm kind of booked through the summer anyway.
I think that is just about all the time we have for today. Ken, I want to thank you one more time for being here with us this afternoon. And I would also like to thank everyone for tuning in the chat and spending this afternoon with us. Before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
Just thanks to you, Corey. It is such a pleasure working with LSU Press on my second book. I'm really thrilled to be doing a third one with Alyssa and Rand and all of the folks at LSU Press. It's really a magnificent operation.
Well, I can say, I can speak safely for all of us that it is our pleasure. Um, and that's all we have. Thanks again, and until next time.
Bye, everybody.